Feels good to be back in this chair. I've been gone for a week. I was in Atlanta just kicking it. I ate like crazy, and I just had fun. And if you see my light shifting, that's because the clouds are going over the sun. I wanted to make this video right now because it's really the only time I had today to make that video. So if you kind of see some light shifting, that's why. So just ignore that. Today we are going to talk about the photographer's triangle. Now, I'm not throwing up an Illuminati sign, I promise. That is what we're going to reference as the photographer's triangle. Now, if you are a Delta out there, I mean, no disrespect. And if you are a part of the Rock Nation with Jay-Z, I mean, no disrespect. But this is the coolest way that I know how to keep you guys interested and to remember the photographer's triangle. So anytime you see this thing thrown up, if you've watched my video, you might think Delta, you might think Rock Nation, but you might also think photographer's triangle. So what's actually in the photographer's triangle? We got ISO, we got aperture, and we got shutter speed. So what is ISO, aperture, and shutter speed? So let's start off with ISO. ISO is your camera sensitivity to light. So if you look on your camera, some cameras may have it, some cameras may not have it. If you're shooting on something like iPhone, you're probably not gonna see the ISO because they're gonna do it all for you. But if you do have a camera that has ISO on it, you should just see ISO. And what that pretty much does is it's the light sensitivity for your camera. When you crank that thing up, more light hits that sensor and you essentially brighten your image up. Now, I'll talk about later why that can be a good thing and that can be a bad thing depending on your camera. The next thing is shutter speed. Shutter speed controls how fast your shutter shuts, pretty much. If you're shooting things like sports, if you're shooting things like high fast movement stuff, if you want to capture something in time, like that's where your shutter speed will come in handy. You can crank that bad boy up and it will stop time pretty much. And that's what shutter speed does. And then the last thing is aperture. Aperture pretty much deals with light. Aperture is going to either be referred to as aperture or f-stop. Most people call it the f-stop. So if you see aperture or f-stop, they're one and the same. Aperture is pretty much light passing through your lens's diaphragm. Whenever you hear people say they're shooting wide open, that usually means that they've stopped all the way down to the lowest f-stop or aperture that their lens can do. I'm currently shooting at an f2.8. I have a Tamron 28-75 and it stops down to f2.8, and that means that I'm as wide open as I can be, letting the most light in without adding modifiers or boosting the ISO, whatever, right? And my lens does all the way up to I think f16 or f22. I'm not really sure, but I can leave a notation on the bottom and let you know what that f-stop is. So these three things play together to help you create an image, whether that be photography or videography. Now we're going to focus on photography today because videography is a little different. You deal with frame rates. You don't change the shutter speed as much like you would in photography. And if you have a Sony camera like I do and you're shooting in a log format, your base ISO is going to be a lot higher than what I'm going to recommend it be in photography, especially if you're shooting out in the daylight. So that's why we have to separate these things, because video and photo a little different. So the photography triangle helps you create the image, and all of these things are important, right? So if we're going in order, I usually start with the f-stop first because that lets me know how much light I want to pass through my lens, and it also lets me know what I want my image to look like. What do you mean by that, Mo? So when you shoot at the lowest aperture, that means only certain things are going to be in focus, right? So if you've ever seen these photos where you see the subject and then you see these completely blown out backgrounds, they probably stopped all the way down, which means they're probably shooting at the lowest aperture that they can possibly shoot at, right? Now, some lenses can shoot down to 1.4, some lenses can do 0.95. Now, why would you ever want to stop down to 0.95? I don't know, but it's available for you. And if you go out and shoot with 0.95 and you nail it, please show me. Send me a DM on Instagram showing me. I would love to see it. But anyway, on the opposite end, you can go all the way up to f16, f22, depending on your lens. Different strokes for different folks, right? So sometimes when you're using that aperture, you shoot the subject and you have this nice blurry background and it looks completely dreamy and it looks amazing, right? And then sometimes you're shooting a subject and you want everything in focus. So these are what these different aperture ranges are for. There's no right or wrong. Me personally, I like the subject to be in focus and the background to be blown out. But again, there's no right or wrong. If you're one of those that like everything in focus, that's completely fine. You might not be a portrait photographer, so having your background blown out might not matter to you, especially if you're a landscape photographer or you like to shoot cities or anything that has to do with having everything in focus. You're probably gonna focus more on the higher side of the aperture. Now, let's talk about light when it deals with aperture. So when the aperture is stopped all the way down, you're gonna let more light in because you're opening that shutter and that lens all the way up. So a lot of light is gonna pass through, right? But when the aperture is set all the way high to f16 or f22, when you stop in all the way up to your highest point of your aperture, although you're getting everything in focus, you're also closing that shutter, which is letting less light come through. So that's why the first thing I focus on is aperture, because I ask myself, do I want a subject that's in focus and the background to be blurred, or do I want everything to be in focus? And it really just comes down to what you're shooting. I don't want to recommend shoot at 2.8 if you're a landscape photographer, and I don't want to recommend shooting f16 if you're a portrait photographer. These lanes are completely different, and that really comes down to what you picked up your camera for. The next thing we're gonna hop into is shutter speed. Let's say we are shooting f2.8, but we wanna capture somebody running, and we still want to blow that background out, but we wanna capture somebody running. This is where shutter speed comes into play. Shutter speed is going to tell your camera how fast. So let's say we're shooting 1/50, you're probably gonna have a blurrier image because your camera shutter is going to react slower than if you're shooting 1/200, right? Normally when I shoot sports, I try to stay 200 plus, and that really comes down to how much light I have overall. Shutter not only helps you to stop a moving subject quickly, but it also helps you, cut down on the amount of light that is coming through your camera. Let's say you're out and you're shooting at f2.8, right? Because you want that portrait style photo, you want that subject to be in focus and that background to be blown out, but the sun is beaming. And that's where shutter comes in handy, because now you can boost that shutter and essentially cut the amount of light that is coming into your camera. So the higher the shutter, the less amount of light, the lower the shutter, the more amount of light. With that being said, depends on the situation. If you are shooting at night and your subject is not moving fast, and let's say you don't have a flash or anything, but you're around some type of light source that is enough for you to be able to handle that shot, you can lower that shutter. As long as your subject's not moving too much, you should be able to nail them without any crazy motion blur. And again, unless you want motion blur, I've seen plenty of pictures that look really cool with motion blur. So it really just comes down to what you want to do with the image that you're taking. And then lastly, ISO. I deal with ISO last, and this is why. Because essentially it's the sensitivity of the light that's coming in your camera, right? So if you boost that ISO, you're gonna get more light. And if you reduce that ISO, it brings the light down, correct? So that sounds good, right? So Mo, you should be able to take your camera out and just shoot at night and just boost that ISO and be great, right? Wrong. Although it helps bring light into your camera by boosting that light sensitivity, it can also add what we call noise to your images. And you don't want noise in your images unless, again, it's a creative thing that you decided you wanted to do. All of these rules can be broken, right? But the thing that I want you guys to do is learn those fundamentals. See, I can remember when I was younger, I used to watch people like Allen Iverson and all of these dope point guards, right? Dwayne Wade, I know he played shooting guard, but he also played point guard. But the point is, I used to watch these people and I used to be like, man, that crossover is a killer, and man, their game is, amazing, right? And I wanted to just play just like that. So I can remember being young, stepping out on the court for the first time and being absolute trash. Like, I couldn't dribble to save my life. I couldn't shoot because I'm watching them, but I don't understand the fundamentals. I never learned how to dribble. I never learned how to shoot. I never learned how to do these things. And when I got out on the court, you could see that I couldn't perform. I didn't know how to do a crossover. I didn't know how to do a layup. I didn't know how to do these things because I never learned the fundamentals. So this is why I want to teach you the fundamentals. Once you understand the fundamentals, then you'll learn how to also break those rules to where it is creative and it works for you. But anyway, back to ISO. ISO plays a really key feature, but it's also the last thing that I want to mess with, because sometimes, once you get that aperture and that shutter speed right, and you have your ISO set, you're good. But sometimes you do have to, boost that ISO, and you can boost that ISO. So I usually start at 100, especially like if I'm in broad daylight, like the sun, or we got some overcast, like the clouds, which are my favorite times to shoot. Also, if you're new to photography, you go out and shoot sunset or sunrise, I promise you they're gonna think you're a pro. Jumping back into ISO can be boosted or lowered depending on the situation. If you're in broad daylight, you might want to keep that ISO around 100 because you don't need that much sensitivity on your sensor, right? But if you're in a darker situation, you might want to boost that ISO. Depends on your camera limitations. If you start seeing noise being introduced into your images, then maybe that's where you should stop. Or start adding lights, or if you don't have lights, maybe find an area where there's more light so you don't have to boost that ISO all the way up. Full frame is gonna allow more light, and it's gonna allow more light sensitivity, which means I'm gonna be able to boost that ISO up a little further than what a crop sensor camera is going to do. I did used to rock with a Sony a6300, and I was able to boost my ISO pretty far. That being said, when it comes to the a7 III or any of the A7 lines, my A6300 or the A6000 series period, it's not going to keep up with an A7 in a full frame lineup. But if you do have a crop sensor camera, that's completely okay. I did a lot on my crop sensor camera, and I have friends that still use their crop sensor cameras and they make phenomenal videos and they shoot phenomenal photos. So don't feel like I gotta hop over to a full frame camera. I switched cameras because I started to understand my limitations with the A6300. So let's recap. When you're dealing with ISO, you're dealing with light sensitivity. When you're dealing with shutter speed, you're dealing with how fast your camera's gonna take that image or how slow your camera's gonna take that image. And when you're dealing with aperture, pretty much it's gonna tell your camera how much you want in focus and how least you want in focus. They all deal with light, yes, but again, ISO is gonna deal with light sensitivity, shutter speed is gonna deal with how fast, how slow, and aperture is gonna tell your camera, hey, if we stop down to a 2.8, we want this in focus and the rest blown out, or if we shoot at f16, we want everything in focus, right? So these three things play really well together when you're out shooting, and I can't stress this enough to learn all three. The way I start, aperture, shutter speed, ISO. That's the way I do it. That's the way I know most people do it. If you want to go a different route with it, by all means, but I ask myself, how in focus do I want the subject compared to everything else going on in the scene? Or how much do I want to blow that background out, right? So that's why I start with aperture. Then I hop into that shutter speed. Am I working with something that's moving fast? Or are we working with something that's just standing still? Or are we working during the day where I have a lot of light that I can use, so maybe we need to roll that shutter speed up? Or are we working in lower light and maybe I need to roll that shutter speed down? So shutter speed is also going to deal with light and motion and how fast and how slow your shutter goes off. And then ISO, how far can I boost that ISO before I start to introduce noise, right? If you're on a professional shoot, or if you want images to look good, or if you just want to take a clean image that you can print, these fundamentals are putting that camera in manual and also switching it to raw. That way you can manipulate these things in post. And then learning that photography triangle. Remember, you can throw up this photography triangle sign and we gonna make it happen, right? So we gotta learn that photography triangle if we want to shoot better images. Your favorite photographers, they know these things, they practice these things millions and millions and millions of times. So I hope this video wasn't too long, and I hope I explained the importance of the photography triangle. If you have any questions, please hop down in that comment section and let me know. And if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And also share this video with someone that is also wanting to learn photography and videography. Or even if they were not wanting to learn photography and videography, just share this video anyway. That's all I have. I am out. I'm gonna go get me something to eat. But remember, photography triangle. So when you're out in the field doing this and you got a Delta or a Rock Nation person saying you're throwing a Dynasty sign up or whatever, tell them no, that's the photography triangle. Photography triangle.